I think let's wait until 5 past 4, and then we could start around that time. Okay, we could actually begin. I think the crowds and the participants will be joining us. Greetings and namaskar. Thank you, Nepal Economic Forum, for organizing this panel. Thank you, the panel members, for joining us, and thank you to all the participants who are virtually linked to us through Zoom or Facebook for devoting your time. My name is Semanta Dahal. I practice law, and I'm partner with Abhinawa Law Chambers. I'll be your moderator for today's panel. When the COVID-19 pandemic first hit Nepal around March 2020 last year, the hospitals in Nepal lacked all healthcare materials needed to initiate an effective COVID response. The nation was in immediate need for COVID test equipment, be the PCR test or the rapid test, protective gears for frontline health workers, face masks, beds, ventilators, oxygen, etc. A frantic procurement process followed to avert the crisis. Emergency procurement provisions in the Nepal's Public Procurement Act were invoked. Specifications for the medical goods and the prices were hastily drawn, and procurement was conducted through closed shopping. A procurement for around $1 million was announced by the Department of Health. However, we are all aware of that, what happened back then. The healthcare materials could not even be procured in time, and the entire procurement process last year fell apart. The process was questioned for lack of transparency, for being costly, for issues related to misconduct, not to mention for corruption issues. May I request the participants in the Zoom call, if you are not speaking, could you place your mic in mute?
होइन मैले हेरेको मात्रै सर त्यो पढ्यो मात्रै हैन आज म सरको चाहिँ रिप्लाई गर्ने पक्षमा थिएँ
Mr. Manoj Yadav, can you mute?
Manoj, can you please mute your, or someone from any of the administrator, can you just mute him? Right. So what I was saying was, last year the procurement process fell apart, and we couldn't procure the goods on time, and and all the medical supplies that were needed could not be supplied on time. Now, fast forward to this year, 2021 March, government did not improve on the mistakes made last year. Especially for the vaccine procurement, the government placed reliance only on one supplier. In government's own parlance, or government's own word, a government-to-government procurement model was used for supplies of vaccines. But the deal could not move ahead. The health minister even went public, whining with grievances of intermediaries asking for commission. The intermediaries, on the other hand, have denied any such matters related to commission. Unfortunately, because of these procurement failures, the citizens continue to suffer. We know that this COVID-19 is its first global pandemic we have personally experienced, but this will certainly not be the last one, as speculations are there that series of its waves will keep coming and hit us. This only makes the discussion on procurement management and procurement of contracts during pandemic even more necessary and timely. Thus, it's great that Nepal Economic Forum is organizing this Neftalk on procurement during pandemic response and failures. The overall objectives, of this Neftalk session, as Nepal Economic Forum, usually calls this panel discussion, is to understand the current state of procurement system being adopted and practiced in Nepal by government procurement entities during the pandemic, especially the goods procurement for medical supplies, delve deeper into the hurdles and challenges faced in the procurement process, provide possible solutions and the ways that can serve as a way forward to tackling the current issues at hand, and strengthen the state capacity for procurement in Nepal. Today, we are joined by three distinguished speakers in the panel from Nepal and the United Kingdom. practicing barrister in the UK and senior fellow of public procurement law, Public Procurement Research Group, University of Nottingham, Professor Dr. Peter Trepte, Professor Dr. Rajendra Adhikari, Professor of Construction Management. And he's also an expert of public procurement, contract administration, and dispute resolution. He was also former member secretary of, General Secretary of the Nepal Council of Arbitration. Someone muted me. Anyway, we also have US trained lawyer and member and volunteer with COVID Alliance Nepal, Kabita Parajuli in the panel. I welcome you all in the panel. We are running the session under time limitation, and I seek apologies in advance from the speakers if I happen to interject them in between. I am intending to request our panelists to reflect on some of the questions I have, to draw the broad contours of the discussions, and thereafter we'll take questions from our august audience here through Zoom chat box or Facebook. Let me turn to Professor Trepte first. Nepal's public procurement legislation is largely modeled on model public procurement law developed by Ancestral. The model law also the Nepali public procurement law permits emergency procurement in situations such as the pandemic, allowing procurement entities to sometimes derogate from the ordinary procurement process and adopt direct opaque contracting methods. In your view, is COVID-19 pandemic a situation justifying the need for disregarding competition? Even if competitive process is disregarded, can value for money and transparency still be achieved? Professor Dr. Trepte.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me to this Neftalk. I'm very honored to be invited. But clearly I don't have experience in Nepal. So what I wanted to do was talk a little bit about the experience from an international perspective. And of course, the question is very topical. I mean, it's clearly very focused. But if I could just talk around it a little bit, because I can't answer it in terms of what's happening in Nepal, but maybe I could talk about it in terms of what's happening in the rest of the world. And I have to say, I have been involved in assisting the different banks and different countries in trying to address some of these problems that have arisen. It's pretty obvious to say that, excuse me, that this is a pandemic without precedent, and it's caused legal problems in all jurisdictions, in developed and developing countries alike. I don't know if you've even heard the news about the United Kingdom, but we haven't been doing this very well either. There was a National Audit Office report fairly recently showing that something like 18 billion pounds, the equivalent of 24 billion US dollars, was awarded for PPE equipment based purely on recommendations, and there weren't any records or minutes of any of these transactions. So we're certainly not beyond reproach in the United Kingdom. Now, I think it's probable to say that it's quite fair to say that a lot of weaknesses in procurement do stem from the legal system itself. But I have to say, I don't think any procurement system, however well drafted, would be able to address all of the problems that have been thrown up by the pandemic. And I think it may be less a legal problem than a question of market failure. We've already heard in the introduction that it's really a question sometimes of a lack of supply, shortage of supply, and security of supply. And then there have been some countries who've been leveraging power and resources to buy and supply and stockpile, which has led, of course, to escalating prices. We've heard about that already, and fraudulent procurement. Of course, there's a higher risk of corruption in these situations as well. As I said, the initial problems seem to be legal, and that's exactly what the question deals with. And where there are problems of the law, then I think clearly we need to sort that out for the future. But the scope and the severity of the crisis really means that there would always be more need to be done. It's not just a question of law. Some of these are predictable, some emergencies are predictable. Scientists even said that this was predictable. And in those cases, we can prepare better for for these sorts of emergencies. We don't know when things are going to happen, but we do know they will happen. And so we could be prepared for this. That's one of the lessons, is we weren't prepared for this, at least in procurement terms, we weren't prepared for this pandemic, even though we were warned that it might come along. So some of things like framework agreements might have been a possibility. We could have used those as a means of preparing. But again, coming to the question that I was asked, even in emergency, the key really is to ensure compliance with the procurement legislation in force. We should use competitive procedures whenever possible, especially when timelines can be met, because not everything in an emergency is subject to very strict timelines. Of course, at the very beginning, we needed to do lots of things in order to get the PPE equipment and the vaccines up and ready. But it's not always the case. The pandemic has now lasted for, almost 24 months. And what was an emergency before is not an emergency now. We know perfectly well what is coming. We can predict these different waves. So it's not an emergency where we can't follow the timelines that exist, even if they're accelerated timelines. So we have to be careful that we don't use the emergency of the initial part of the pandemic as a reason for avoiding following perfectly normal procurement rules, which can be applied in the timelines that we have. But there are things in the procurement system, we all know what they are, things like securities, waiting for approvals, those delay the process, even if the procurement itself could carry on fairly quickly. But even when we can't use competition, again, coming back to the question, it is a question of maximizing the use of flexibility and speed under the legislation that exists. And that usually means using some form of single source procurement or direct contracting. And that's perfectly well within the law. The law should foresee those situations. So we're not going outside the law, we're not waiving the law, we're not trying to find some different mechanism. The law does allow for procurement in emergency situations, and we really need to be able to use those systems. The problem is that many procurement systems and many politicians are very fearful of using flexible procurement, of using single source procurement. So it's very difficult sometimes to use that and can often be ineffective. So we need to balance, in a sense, the risk, because there may be a risk, and the outcomes. We need to get PPE, we need to get vaccines quickly. And that's what we've seen in response to COVID. I know I haven't got so much time, and I don't want to overwhelm you with information, but some of the legal issues I've been looking at in different countries come from the problem of the legislation. It's usually, what is the trigger for emergency provisions? What allows procurement or flexible procurement to be used? And one method of doing this, and I have to say I haven't looked to see what happens in Nepal, but one method of doing this is to have some sort of emergency declaration, which says, okay, we have an emergency, now we can use different procedures, we can use some form of direct contracting. That's what happened in the United States, for example. Trump declared an emergency. The problem was he declared it 20 days after the World Health Organization declared the emergency. And to be honest, in Europe, you can do a complete procurement procedure using accelerated time limits within 20 days. That isn't a problem. So, you have a huge delay in waiting for somebody to decide on whether there is an emergency and whether the declaration is feasible. And it's discretionary. The law doesn't say when an emergency should happen, and the conditions are not very clearly established. So it's very hard to know when that emergency happens. And of course, if you can't start an emergency procurement until you know that that has been done, we have a problem. We've had a delay just because of the emergency declaration. And then another problem, which we can see now, is that the length of validity of an emergency declaration is sometimes unlimited. In the United States, it's 1 year. And I'm sorry, what may have been an emergency in the first 20 days is not an emergency 12 months later. You can clearly use a proper procurement procedure. So it becomes an excuse to use very poor procurement, very bad procurement without competition. And there, of course, we lose the value for money that was inherent in the question. And the second method, and Semanta asked the question about UNCITRAL model law. Here, it's not a question of declaring an emergency. What happens in the UNCITRAL model law is that you have to, it defines immediacy. So it allows action under the law where the procuring entity recognizes the urgency. And of course, the benefit of this is if the procuring entity recognizes the urgency and it fits within the definition of the law, then it can carry on, it can start the procurement straight away. It doesn't have to wait for some politician, even if it's the president, to decide that there's emergency. It recognizes the emergency and it can start the procurement immediately. Of course, that would be used where there isn't enough time to use the normal procedure. So you have conditions on that, and that's sort of the lack of foreseeability. The problem with UNCITRAL, and I have to say this up front, is that provides for two levels of urgency, and it's not very clearly defined. So in one, you can use a restricted procedure, in another, you can use a direct procedure. And that's a problem that I've seen in several countries that I've been working in. The definitions don't really help you decide when to do an emergency procurement. And yes, we can argue about it, lawyers can look at it, but actually, if a procuring entity needs to buy, what it needs is clarity, not some form of statutory interpretation. We're not going to sit there trying to work out what the law says. We want to know what we can do. So that's obviously been a problem in different countries. I think procurement legislation really has been a bit of a blunt instrument in this respect, because it doesn't tell you, the law is the law, it tells you what the main provisions are, but it doesn't deal with lots of individual situations. And I think in practice, lots of countries have felt that there's been a need to have special guidance. The problem is, of course, it takes as long to prepare the guidance as it does to do procurement. So you lose such a lot of time. That's something that needs to be prepared in advance. And sometimes it's just an explanation of the law. The law might be perfectly clear, but people don't always understand it. It could be a question of capacity. And by doing the guidance, you sometimes see what the problems are with the law and where it could be amended. So that's something, that's a sort of a lesson that we could learn. And so what I'll finish here just by talking about some of the things that we might learn for next time. To the extent that we can predict problems, these are usually weather-related emergencies, which I'm sure you have in Nepal as well. But even if we know something's going to happen, and here we can talk about second and third waves, we can put something in place, we can predict them, and maybe we can have some form of framework agreement to deal with that. We need to clarify the law to trigger the flexible procedures quickly and simply. And from what I've said, you'll obviously understand I'm not a great fan of emergency declarations. I think the law can very easily set this out very clearly and simply. It's just a question of being able to apply that. We can then remove lots of obstacles which remove the possibility for flexible and quick action and don't add value. And here I'm going to talk about things like bid securities, that they don't help, and getting them and paying for them takes time and slows everything up. And even approvals, trying to get approvals from superior authorities, that also takes time. Now you can strengthen the conditions for using flexible procedures and strengthen the complaint mechanism to deal with that. So you don't always have to have approvals. And maybe the guidance that is being developed, maybe that could be developed into a manual to cover extraordinary situations. So from what we've learned already, we should put in place a manual on how to use the law in a better way. And of course, we have to be ready to address the market failures. Procurement bodies are not very good at doing this, we know that. But we need to be able to apply the competition rules properly and anti-corruption provisions. And maybe we need to engage in cooperative procurement. I'm hesitant to say that because the European Union is an example of how not to do cooperative procurement, but it is possibly a way of dealing with this. Mm-hmm. So there's much more to discuss, and I'm really looking forward to our Neftalk now to see what different ideas come up. But hopefully that's sort of set the scene for what's happened internationally. And I'm sure some of that is reflected in what happens in Nepal. And I'm looking forward to hearing that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Trepte. I think there are broad themes that you designed or stated in that initial remarks that you said. I know to move on to Professor Adhikari, I think I'll take a few points that you mentioned. You mentioned that procurement, especially government procurement, is not really a legal problem sometimes, and that is a key message I can hear from you. So the one I think I can hear is that there's a need to balance speed and also effective procurement process. So for that we need to make sure that we don't always use emergency provisions and cut short the competitive process there. So based on those initial thoughts that you said, I'll draw upon the experience of Dr. Rajendra Adhikari and pose a question here. You must have been closely evaluating the procurement process being followed by the Nepali procuring entities for last year, especially the health departments and the hospitals. How do you see the response to the pandemic? And has the government really eliminated the bureaucratic red tape that is required, or in eliminating the bureaucratic red tape, or in cutting short the process? Did the entire procurement integrity, the integrity that is required in a procurement process, was that all compromised or not? How could you just provide your reflections on that? Thank you. You're in mute, Dr. Adhikari.
Okay, sorry. Thank you, Semanji. There was very nice initiation from the Professor Peter. He comprehensively gave a glance about the procurement procedure. And it is to be understood that whether procurement be policy-based or procedure-based. This is one aspect that we have to always discuss on, and we have to follow one principle to procure. There is no any law that comes physically, stand in front of us and stop procuring or responding to the pandemic. In this regard, just I would like to share with you two examples of some this type of pandemic procurement that has created very controversy, and a lot of questions were raised. So first, let's look at the first procurement at the initial stage of when the pandemic begins and the government started responding to the pandemic. In that regard, now, in 13 March 2020, one procurement process started, and it was rightly started by Department of Health Services, which is the authority and agency to look after all this medical and health related procurement. So it rightly started process, and it gave us 7 days notice, and 19 suppliers were interested to supply medical equipment like PCR machines and rapid test kits. And when this was started and the discussion was going on, department wanted to have all those materials supplied within 7 days. And the suppliers were advising the government that it is not possible, considering the global pandemic situation, that it would require 30 to 45 days to get the supply. This discussion or a sort of negotiation was going on. Government was saying that we will facilitate, we will coordinate all the required things now, but just try to procure within 7 days. By that time, in 24th March, government imposed lockdown, and the same day, the high-level committee directed ministry to initiate procurement procedure within 24 hours. So this direction initiated another parallel process of procurement. And on 26th, a discussion was held, separate discussion with 35 suppliers, and only 7 suppliers said that they could do as the government said regarding the supply medical equipment. And the same day, it is agreed, a separate meeting was conducted with 7 suppliers, and the same days they agreed that they will submit proposal to the government for supply of this medical equipment by 7 p.m. the same day. What happened? Only 2 suppliers submitted price proposal, and among this submitted price proposal, the Omni International, which was in controversy afterward. The bid submitted by this was accepted, and the supply amount was 1.24 billion Nepalese rupees, equivalent to this. This agreement was made, and the discounting was a 0.05% discounting was made. No? So this was agreed, and immediately after agreement was signed, and as per the agreement that the medical equipment has to be brought in 3 installment, 30% first, 30% second, and 40% at the end. Immediately, 10% equipment were brought, but they were also questionable in terms of their standard, their quality. It is said that they did not meet the quantity and they are below standard. And that invited a lot of row, and a lot of controversies started publishing and reporting by the medias. And what happened, the contract amount, the value was only about 20%. No? So, and then in midway, without having any examination, the procurement process just disturbed, and the contract with this Omni was terminated. So this is the first controversial cases, and we could not rightly response the pandemic. So this was first scenario. This was that neither we follow policies, nor we follow the procedure, neither we follow the emergency government declaration, nor we follow the procurement law of the country. No? So this sort of confusion we can see in this procurement. Now, briefly, I will toss this second, the current procurement, which is again invited a lot of controversies, and a lot of senior citizens who have received the first dose of vaccine could not get the vaccine, and the second dose of vaccine for other just has begun because of this failure in procurement by anyway. So this is related to procurement of vaccine. So we didn't learn from the first that mistake also, where there was the lapses. We didn't learn from that. On January 2021, Cabinet approved a concept paper forwarded by the ministry, which was related to receiving and using of vaccine against COVID-19. And then agreement was made with the Hukam distribution, which is now in, again, controversy, which is the authorized agent of Serum Institute of India to supply 2 million doses of vaccines. And after signing this agreement, it supplied 50% of vaccine, that is 1 million doses of vaccine arrived. And that is what given to the senior citizens first. That was the first vaccine initiated in the country. And during this period, the next lot was to arrive. Ministry again initiated negotiation for additional 5 million doses of vaccine directly with the Serum Institute of India. So first time, why government discussed in the presence of local agent, and why not this time? So this flaws, this gap we can see in the procurement process. What happened that afterward, the news came out that the agent disturbed the procurement process because there was an issue of the agent's commission. So whether there was issue of commission or not for additional 5 million doses of procurement, this is silent anyway. And again, the minister, it is reported that minister said that for 27 days we could not procure, or we could not make effective the procurement process. We could not make any decision because of local agent. So what is this for ministry? What sort of procurement procedure that you have followed? It is not there. Again, by this 27 days, the situation has been changed. The pandemic, COVID-19 situation has been dramatically changed in India, and with the supplier manufacturing company also, the situation was changed. Because of that, this procurement process also went on limbo. So this is the case now. So we did not follow the procedure, and nowhere that the procurement law has stopped. Procurement law has raised the question why you are doing this or why you did not do this. No? So this type of situation that has been taken in Nepal. No? So we have to, I think, analyze this type of situation differently so that we could learn and we could improve our process and we could effectively start responding to the pandemic. So I think this is what I would like to share right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Adhikari. I think you said that I think the act itself is not an obstacle here. It's probably the capacity and the way the entire process was conducted, which has really put the process in limbo. I saw some comments on the chat box. I think there was a question by former Secretary Krishna Gewali whether we have anyone representing the Department of Health or PPMO. I think NEF did invite or send invitations out to them. And if we have anyone from those entities, we'd love to hear you. A time for you to speak or respond to some of the questions that we have here. One thing I want to now say probably is that Professor Trepte mentioned about this entire pandemic response is not about a legal problem but more of a shortage of supplies, a supply chain issue. So taking that thread ahead, I want to now approach Ms. Kabita Parajuli. Kabita ji, you have been in the front line in managing the crisis posed by the pandemic, burning your personal hours and energy to ensure steady supply of oxygen cylinders, generation plants, concentrators to the people, to those which are these things are required. This must have been a demanding. This must have been very demanding for you, and especially when the supply chain has been disrupted entirely. So I want you to reflect on your experience in mitigating some of the supply crisis and making sure that you've been able to make sure there's some supply of oxygens and required medical equipment to the persons who are in need. Thank you.
Thank you, Semanta, and thank you, Rajendra and Professor Trepte for sharing some of your experiences and framework and thoughts, and to everyone who's here. I think all of the work that we've been doing from the team that I'm part of, the COVID Alliance for Nepal, has been us trying to support the efforts of frontline workers in hospitals and medical staff. And so it has been really interesting for me and also deeply painful to get to witness at multiple levels what some of the issues have been, whether it's been supporting the team that's doing direct oxygen supply and doing runs at 5 a.m. in the morning and navigating different challenges there, to then helping with some of these like larger scale purchases. So of some equipment that hasn't come through yet, some things that have just fallen through, and learning just what a total roller coaster ride the procurement process is. By training, I am a lawyer, and by personality, I like details and I like to be as thorough as possible. But when you're doing procurement in what is an emergency situation, and in some ways is a manufactured emergency because of a lack of preparedness, despite everything pointing in the direction of what we're seeing now, then you end up with what is a crisis, and where you then do have to circumvent what would otherwise be ordinary procedures. So I hope I'm answering the question that you're asking me, Semanta. Yeah. I think the core principles that we've tried to follow is that, one, recognizing that real-time procurement in a time of crisis is extremely difficult because supply chains that have been vetted and of registered vendors are gone, because countries that have those long-standing relationships and that can put in enormous amounts of money just leverage a different type of power than certainly a country like ours can, but that smaller trading companies or people who are trying to procure can. And that has been challenging. And of course, it is a challenge that is exacerbated by a lack of coordination across the different types of actors who could recognize and then move towards procurement through ordinary or even recognized emergency government actions. So that means we have to go what some members of our team have called guerrilla. Now, at the same time, that doesn't mean that we just disregard what procurement requires. And so the core principles of our approach have included what I think are the core principles of good procurement, I would hope, anywhere. Looking at transparency, looking at accountability, trying to make sure that we're getting good value for money, and figuring out what timelines look like. And that value for money question, when you're operating as a group of individuals who may have a great network but are not a government agency, involves a lot of creativity. So drawing on the expertise of people we know who are working in oxygen supply, people we know who are engineers, who are management consultants, who may have legal expertise, really reaching to the expertise of people on the ground, healthcare workers, like who can tell us what is needed. And so starting with, okay, what is actually needed? How do we get these things with, again, those 4 things that I listed? And then recognizing that even with that in mind, that the process is distorted. So normally you might have a month or X number of weeks in which you can respond to a quote or for which a price point is kept. But that just isn't the case right now. So 2 weeks ago, I was looking at a set of concentrators, which, you know, concentrators are a temporary measure. They fill in a gap and help take off a load from a central supply in the absence of greater generation capacity. Now, when I got the quote, when I received a quote that a trusted vendor had shared with another group that I also know, the quote was about $500, between $450 and $500 for 10-liter capacity oxygen concentrators that were of a recognized high quality standard. By the time I responded to, followed up 4 days later, that amount was $850. And by the time I was able to talk to my team and get back to him another day later, that point had reached $1,200 for the same good. So within the span of a week, that price had doubled, more than doubled. It had basically tripled if we compared to even what the regular price would be. So I think getting to see that in real time made me, one, deeply empathetic to the challenge that a lot of different agencies are in right now, but also I think drove home the importance of why we look at data and why we need data systems to plan for these kinds of events and why you need a coordinated and centralized point. So that I think is a really core point. And then the matter of looking at value for money, and again, another of my team members really emphasizes the idea of you trust, but you verify, right? So how do we get the expertise that we need in a limited amount of time to vet a product? So for example, last night, earlier this week, I was connected to someone who is an oxygen supply, I'm gonna say expert, because I think she has a really high level of expertise, even though I don't love the term. And she runs a company. Sorry, what's my time, Semanta? I don't want to drone on and on.
No, you can take another couple of minutes. Yeah, that should be okay.
Okay.
2 more minutes.
Okay, so so the COVID Alliance is a network. Our goal is to amplify work, it's to help source money and give it to folks who are doing work on the ground, and also to make sure that we're creating a platform where people with different kinds of needs and then supply abilities can connect. So I had the good fortune of being put in touch with someone this week, and then last night someone in Solukhumbu joined us, and not Solukhumbu, that was a different conversation. Last night's conversation was Hilambu, and told us, okay, we have a potential deal on concentrators. I have to make this purchase decision by tomorrow morning. I want to know if what I'm getting is good or not. So I spoke to her at about 11:45 and then again at 1 a.m. To try and vet the concentrators that he was ordering, and was able to learn that unfortunately the supply, which had come up to us through what was supposedly, again, a reputable trader, is really, really not a good product. It will be coming anyway, and it will be coming because of the idea that it will provide some sort of benefit, but it is extremely painful to realize that we're getting bad products, and we're getting it because of a lack of planning on the one hand, and on the other hand, just because of this immense crunch on global supply chains. So those are the examples I just want to give.
Thanks, Kabita. I think you laid out the struggle that you are undergoing, and and how you're managing all that. I think I just want to let the audience know that we have Mr. Chakravarti Kant, Joint Secretary from the Public Procurement Monitoring Office, also as a participant today. We're very indeed happy and delighted to have you as an audience, sir. If you have any questions to ask, or if you want to participate in the discussion, please let us know in the chat box, Mr. Kant, and then we'll try to accommodate to you at some point in time. Thank you very much. I think we have been getting some questions in the chat box too. Please continue to write those questions here. We'll take those questions up as soon as I finish my first round of discussion with the panel members here. I think want to get into this topic of vaccination now probably, and I want to go to Professor Trepte now. Professor Trepte, I think everyone has now, there's a general consensus among health professionals that, vaccination drive is the only probably way to contain the pandemic. But, developing countries like Nepal do not have access to the vaccines, nor the, resources or the capabilities to manufacture the vaccines themselves. There is talk about IP waivers, and even IP waivers may not sometimes, and there's an argument against IP waivers saying that, maybe the quality and, the vaccines quality will not be maintained if, if you allow anyone to manufacture the vaccine. So there's a risk to that too. So in your opinion, do you think government should itself be involved in vaccination procurement? And if you think, government should be the one procuring the vaccines, then if yes, how do you think that should be managed? Alternatively, should you leave it to the market? I mean, should the government license the private players and the private players could, themselves source the vaccines and supply the vaccines to the market? Which approach do you think is more workable and for a country like Nepal?
Goodness, that's a lot of questions all in one simple statement. And I haven't got an answer for that. I can say that already. But what I was interested in was Professor Rajendra and Kabita talking about the different problems they face. And it's not exactly the same, but it is quite similar. The problem with avoiding any sort of regulation is that you don't only stop following the procedures which are difficult and which cause delay. You might also throw out the baby with the bathwater and throw out the things that you really need to concentrate on. So it doesn't matter if there are delays through bid securities or timing or publicity. You still need to have technical specifications. You still need to evaluate technical specifications. You still have to have accountability and avoid different I think there was a question in the chat here to avoid some of these pre-bid problems, and by that I assume it means discussions with people that you know and friends and so forth. And I think that's what was good about what Kabita was saying was, even if you don't apply all of the negative procedures, you should nonetheless follow the better procedures, which is to make sure that you follow the specifications. And in Professor Rajendra's example, that's what wasn't done in the first example there. It was the specifications weren't done properly, even if they should have been. So it's very difficult to throw out the procedures that are there. Now, of course, it means that the procedures that are there need to be clear and enforceable and workable by people. So it's a question of clarity and it's a question of capacity. But I think you were saying who should do it. Well, it's the authority. It's, I think, one of the government duties to look after its citizens and the health of its citizens. So unless it's been delegated to a specific organization, then yes, it is the government that needs to deal with it. They are faced with an impossible situation because, as we heard from those examples, the supply market is not able to supply, or it may not be able to, or it may be doing it in a way that isn't really acceptable. But it's very hard to deal with that, where it's so unpredictable, we don't know. But I don't think the answer is to ignore procurement principles. I don't think the answer is to have a free-for-all, because that does lead to different problems. If, as Kabita said, you do impose accountability principles, if you follow those, then to the extent that somebody is putting in price gouging is the word I keep hearing about that, increasing the prices, then you will ultimately be accountable for that. And if that's a criminal offense, and in many countries it is, you can be taken to court for that. At the time, we'll just pay it, but later you are held accountable for for those sorts of procedures. So I think it's a question of not only applying the good bits of procurement rules, and there are bad bits when it comes to emergencies, but you can hopefully, if the law is clear enough, ignore that. But it does mean applying the good bits, which should apply regardless of emergency, and keeping everybody to account. And where you have competition laws that apply and anti-corruption laws, applying those to the full. I mean, in the UK, we've had loads of people now go to court for having made massive commissions on procurement, which they had nothing to do with. I mean, it's happened. Mm-hmm. And one of our examples about non-specification is and not accountability was the Prime Minister in the UK talking to his friend, Sir, what's his name, Dyson, who makes vacuum cleaners, to provide ventilator machines. Of course, they'd never produced them, but I suppose it's, instead of sucking, it's blowing. So I'm sure there's a way of turning a vacuum cleaner into a ventilator, but there was no experience, there was no technical specification. And in the end, they spent hundreds of millions of pounds and there was no product. So they didn't go through a process, they didn't they didn't have a technical specification, they weren't accountable, and that's what happened. So I think applying some of these basic principles, these core principles, is important, even if we have a difficult market situation.
Professor Trepte, I think I have a question to you based on what you said about commission there. Some of the commission has been the most controversial issue these days, especially in relation to the vaccine procurement in Nepal. So you talked about commission and you said that some of these people or the companies have been taken to court because of that. Can you just explain me us, what went wrong, or what was the reason behind, those parties being taken to the court?
To be honest, I don't know the details of that. It happened in the UK, and although I'm from the UK, I'm not actually based there now, and I haven't followed on. But this was an economic tort of some sort, so it was profiteering, and that can be a crime, and I think that's what's been underneath that. I think if there's been an element of corruption, which there could have been, so there may have been some coordination between the procurement, then that's much easier to prosecute because that is a criminal offence. I think if it's just somebody profiteering, then it can be an economic crime, but that's much more difficult to prove, and it is just somebody taking advantage of the situation. So I don't know the details, but my suspicion is that there must have been some criminal element, there must have been some corruption involved in the commission. So it wasn't just somebody making a huge profit because he saw the advantage, but actually there was some coordination with people within the procuring entity, is my guess. I can't say that because I don't know the details, but I know it has happened. They have been taken to court for those crimes.
Okay. Thank you. Before I take before I take the questions that I've received in the chat box, I'll have two questions each for one question each for Dr. Adhikari and Kabita ji. So Dr. Adhikari, I think I also saw one point being mentioned here regarding the government-to-government procurement model, and one of the participants here, I think his name was probably Ganendra Ji, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, Ganendra Ji. He talked about, we should be using this government-to-government procurement model for medical supplies. And we've been hearing about this government-to-government model, for a long time, before the pandemic, also for certain other things. But does our public procurement law or system really, address such a procurement model? And what are the special features of a government-to-government model? What is it all about? And is there a role for a private player or a contractor or a supplier in a government-to-government model, or is it just about the government agreeing and then supplying the required goods?
Thank you. This is a very important question, and we have not exercised a lot in this regard, and practically we have not implemented. So there may be different opinions and a lot of confusion, and the confusion not only on the outsiders, that confusion might be with me also. But in this regard, what I would like to share is that the government, Rule 85.5V is what we are saying right now, that is G2G procurement. Yes, government to government. So government to government procurement is not like this. The government, another country's government will procure or get something, buy something in its country and supply that to the government of other country. It is not like that. So in this regard, what our rules says is that it allows public entity to procure directly. The first thing is that, no, this exempted other processes, and you can procure directly with the government from G2G model. And with whom? Either from international intergovernmental agencies or foreign country government or public entity of such foreign country government. So, and on what basis? On the sale prescribed by such agencies, government or public entities. So this is the thing. But to procure from G2G, what we need to know is that whether that government is willing to sell or whether that government is producing public entity or any intergovernmental agency, maybe sometime WHO supplies drugs. No, that may be different. We can procure directly. But regarding this vaccine, there is nothing like that. No, this has been different, and all countries are holding by themselves. So the supply chain has been difficult because of there is no adequate production, and all are of not same standard. There are different variants. No? The Russian variant, the Chinese, and the Indian, what we are talking about to procure rightly. So just mentioning G2G procurement did not give us how and where we procure. So this requires a good supply chain management, when, what type of vaccine that we are requiring. You know? So our planning in terms of date and quantity. And then after, how we can procure. So public procurement law provides ground to procure directly, or single source procurement can also be done. And if it requires, just the cabinet can make decisions for time being or for procurement of vaccine to respond to this pandemic, that procurement can be take place on this ground. So all these things are there which requires a preparation, which requires a planning. That planning may be emergency planning, or that for that preparation, we might have time that we can plan on time. The vaccine planning from 1 year back, no, we know that vaccine are producing by this thing. We are making procurement deal with the different companies, and there are other companies are also there. They may willing to supply. Now, this is the thing, the government can make policy decisions now. So as just Peter rightly just mentioned that framework contract now. Framework contract modality can be adopted, or the procurement, how much quantity can be supplied by Serum Institute of India, and whether that is the cost effective, lowest cost. And if on top of that, now let's negotiate and see the price of other Indian and Chinese vaccines. And we can procure accordingly now. And if government wishes to involve private party, let's try to involve them. And does not like to involve private party for this procurement, that can also be done. So in this regard, I think that there is not that much problem to initiate the procurement process. So only we just be saying that in the lack of my side preparation, the Procurement Act, procurement law is not giving us to procure. So this is wrong understanding in our context. I think Professor Peter would like to say something.
You know, I just wanted to confirm something that you said, that it's even if the law allows for government to government procurement, most governments at the moment are not going to sell anything to anybody else, to no other government. At the University of Nottingham, we're doing this book on the experience of COVID. Of course, it's very legal. We're looking at all these countries we're covering in the Indian subcontinent as well. But I've been researching and doing a chapter, not on government to government contracting, but more on import and export restrictions that are being imposed by different governments on sale of vaccines. And one of the things you see is that all the governments are closing off their borders. They're actually preventing exports in order to build up their own capacity for PPE and vaccines. So it's very unlikely that you're going to see lots of government-to-government contracting. It's quite the opposite. They're closing their markets. And you may have noticed President Biden has reversed the initiative, but President Trump tried to remove all of the medicines and vaccines that would really help in COVID from their coverage of the government procurement agreement. That's the World Trade Organization agreement where there's access to markets with all members. And so they've said, well, rather than close our market, we're just going to take all of these medicines and vaccines away from free access, so you can't have them. I mean, that's really what's been happening. So it was just to confirm what Professor Rajendra was saying, that it's all very well being able to do it, but actually in practice, you probably can't anyway.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor, contributing and making clear what I was saying. No? So this is the thing. No? So first we need to have our plan, and we need to understand the terms and the constraint. No? Whether at this stage, vaccine that we can buy, purchase with government to government. So that is problem. So this is the thing that we have to understand. No? So and try to find out, try to learn lesson from what we could do better. No? So I think this is it at this time. I'm also seeing a lot of questions at the chat box. So if time allows, and basically if it is related to pandemic procurement right now, that questions we'll try to entertain, and other we may not be able now, in this forum. Thank you for interest of all the persons. Thank you so much.
I think we've been getting great questions from all the audience here. One thing I think that came a few times is before I move on to Kabita ji, is this commission issue in a government-to-government procurement model. Rajendra sir, I think one of the comment I saw probably was from one of the former secretary. He said, "Can cabinet usually in a decision say, okay, the commission is allowed?" And there are other few comments in the chat box which said, in the entire bid process, the commission, what will be the charge, or what will be the commission that will be taken, should be mentioned in the price proposal itself. So, what is your response to that, Dr. Adhikari?
Okay, thank you. This is another very important question. First, we need to distinguish between that the commission works in two different contexts. One is that the authorized agent, the commission of the authorized agent, which is transparent and agreed while signing the contract. That is allowed and that has to be paid, which was explicitly written in the, as I mentioned, in the vaccine procurement of 2 million doses of vaccine with Hukam distribution, representative of Hukam distribution, that no commission will be charged. It means that is valid communication that is allowed. Now, in terms of other commission that we are talking about, and media is raising the questions, this commission is about some sort of corruption or bribery or any other malpractice. If in this case, then how the government or any cabinet can make a policy or any principle that commission is valid now. So this is ethical and moral questions involved with the procurement, and at the stage of this pandemic. This is why I think that Professor Peter again rightly mentioned that in UK also this is happening, and there may be more cases afterwards. So we should not think in that way. No, it is not only that it is happening in developing country like Nepal. It is happening in developed countries also. The only thing is that the government has good planning. Government try to respond this emergency situation, and after that, the legal procedure will follow. No? This is the thing what we have to understand, I think. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Adhikari. I think I want to now bring in Kabita ji into the discussions again. I have two broad themes of questions to you. I think one is on what Professor Trepte said, government-to-government procurement, where government are refusing or declining to support because the government itself, for that particular country, needs to make sure that supplies are available to their own citizens. So in that context, what we did generally as a developing country do is we look developed nations, especially, and count on their support during the crisis like this. In the evaluation, how proactive have you seen the developed nations been, or even international organizations been extending impactful assistance? That's one question. And probably the other question I have is that, there are a number of activities, volunteering activities, including like yours, who have taken the civic responsibility to probably patch the void that has been created due to ineffective response from the state. Please describe some of the initiatives of COVID Alliance, and also how do you think this civic response could be more effective, and what do you think should be done to make sure that the civic side of things and civic organizations or civic volunteering could really make an impactful assistance for the pandemic and mitigating some of the supply chain risks?
Great, thank you, Semanta. I think it's an interesting pairing of questions. So to the first one, in the context of when a government isn't supplying, I will say one thing that I'll contest the framing slightly, that I think it is almost less about looking to developed countries for assistance than looking at countries who are sitting on massive stockpiles of unused vaccines. The US will, in the next month, have almost 100 million vaccines that they have done nothing to approve or use. There are currently, we know 60 million, President Biden said that he's going to be distributing in the next 2 months, right? By June, I'm speechless every time I consider this timeline, because the sense of urgency that I think we're operating on is so vastly different. So I will say again, like the framing that I would slightly disrupt is that it's not about them being developed, but more about who has a set of goods that are urgently needed, that they're not using, that could be and will be redistributed. And then secondly, to your point about have we seen proactive, impactful assistance? So we know that, for example, one of the first sets of things that have come in have been oxygen cylinders from China, and then from Nepali workers who are working in the Middle East, and then also some goods brought in through a program between USAID and WFP, I believe. Those are all just oxygen cylinders. Those are a stopgap measure. Those still have to be filled somewhere. We have a fraction of the production capacity that we need right now. So it would have been really helpful, actually, if what was sent and also what was requested earlier on were oxygen generator plants. Again, I think this goes back to a question of data, but then also a question of real honesty on the part of the people who have the capacity to make those requests. So no, I would say there hasn't been, unfortunately, terribly proactive assistance. I think that I would like to think that there is the will to do that, but it's hard to really say that with evidence when you haven't seen it backed up. I think that there has been a tremendous amount of advocacy from the Nepali diaspora and also, friends of Nepal in the US in particular, to try and push these kinds of redistributions of material goods. And we hope that that will be landing here soon. But I do question why that has taken the amount of time that it has. We're all very aware of what's taking place. So that is, I think, the first point. The second is that there are, you said there are a number of groups that are volunteering. And oh, and I will say something else to that first point. I think that there is, in order to follow certain kinds of standards and procedures that large multilateral organizations and entities want to, that governments want to, yes, those processes will be slower, but I also think there are groups that are used to responding in emergency contexts. And so sometimes I think the the caveat or I'm going to say excuse, forgive me, that's given of, oh, we needed the government to approve, or oh, we needed this or that to happen. Well, you had knowledge on the ground of what was taking place. We saw those hospital notices roll in. I saw them roll in on my Viber chat. I assume that people in official places did too. And so I do wonder what the lack of responsiveness is about. So then the question of then volunteering and civic response that has to come in the absence of it. One, I don't think it's bad that we have like a civic response, because it will take a little bit longer for certain entities to start acting. I think one of the things that I have really appreciated, again, about the work that the group that I'm organizing with is doing, is an effort to coordinate, to understand where gaps are, to understand what needs are, to bring together people with very different types of expertise and put them in conversation with each other. I think that another instance of a group that's been doing really great work to try and fill in some gaps would be the COVID Connect hotline. They've been quite clear as well, the volume of calls they're getting, for example, versus the number of calls they're able to resolve, sometimes very disparate, not their fault at all. I can only imagine how difficult it is to get calls and then try and place people, especially in the absence of centralized information about the availability of beds. And then we know Hamro Sano Prayas and Hami Nepal Youth Organization have been moving really quickly to try and mobilize. And again, the question for me is, why is the largest public hospital in the country relying entirely on volunteers to set up their isolation areas when those volunteers aren't even fully vaccinated and every single government employee is? So I'm not attacking the government. What I'm saying is rather, we need to find ways of having agencies mandated with certain tasks move more quickly when the need is also clear to the rest of us who are also residents of this same space. So those would be 3 entities that I can think of. And then there are also different online groups where I think people are providing support to each other. There's a group called, I think it's Drishti Nepal, that is trying to support also pregnant and birth-giving people in the context of the shortfalls in care that they're receiving, another really important gap. And then we have been trying also to figure out like a welfare fund for frontline workers, because this time around there hasn't been from insurance companies or the center a clear provision of insurance or any kind of assurance for frontline workers, which includes, of course, like both healthcare workers and then janitorial staff, and then also other kinds of like ambulance drivers and so forth. So one of the challenges in procuring staff for isolation and surge management centers has been that they're not getting insurance, but like presumably that is something that can be addressed with just like a reallocation of resources. And so if we as individual citizens can do that, then certainly the government can do that. And so can private actors like the banks and industry who have under law a CSR mandate. So I think that is where it's that some things that have been effective is quick mobilization, connecting to supply chains, bringing together resources, using a lot of Google Excel sheets to try and coordinate responses. How could things be more effective? By more conversation with each other, and also more Excel sheets. And then also, I think, a recognition of the fact that a movement-oriented model of working is what will get us there, not an individual group, not an individual issue, but all of us working in collaboration.
Thank you, Kabita. I think before you end, there is a question probably that you could respond, because you just talked about Excel sheet. I think there's a question in the chat box in relation to AI, and there's a question if AI has really helped in some of this civic COVID response or not.
Sorry. AI, like artificial intelligence?
Yes.
I don't see that question in the chat box. I do see a question about civil society initiatives and legal accountability. So is the question, how could AI allow us to anticipate?
So the question is, has the digitization AI played a role in the procurement process, help amplify your services?
I see. Unfortunately, I'll have to defer. I don't really know anything about AI.
Right. Okay.
It's a great question, but I don't know anything about that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think so. I probably will try to ask some of the questions I've received in the chat box. I might have to apologize in advance if I cannot ask all those questions, and I know that all those questions are very important and very thoughtful questions that come in. But before I take up the questions, I think I would allow a few minutes time to the Joint Secretary from the Public Procurement Monitoring Office, if it's still available, to take around 2 minutes to probably interject on some of the issues that we discussed now. Nepal Economic Forum, the technical person handling this, could you just enable his mic for a minute? Thank you very much. Mr. Kant, if you are there, we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you. Giving me opportunity at least to put my view, express my view. I would like to first thank all the three finalists, Professor Kabita and Professor Rajendra and Ms. Kabita. Yeah, but the views are totally, totally in terms of the issue that Nepal Economic Forum has raised. I have just want to put, there are many questions, or I would say there are mindset. If there is any public procurement, there is much more chance of fraudulence or malpractices. But we, at the same time, we are ignoring the major portion of private procurement because now also, if any of us are at the beginning stage or even now, if we are going to go to procure either mask or even private hospitals, how they are procuring or what they have to pay about PPEs or oxygens, that is also a major question that we are still missing here. And the legal documents may not be perfect all the time. It goes on amendment and as it requires. But in this case, as our law, procurement law, it totally allows procurement in special circumstances, not only in regulation, but in act also. And the major portion, point that I would like to highlight that though there is written in your concept note that the procurement system is going to be centralized, and it's in Nepal, the procurement law totally gives freedom to public entity chief, whether it is of local level or provincial level or government or federal level. Each public entity chief can proceed its procurement activity on its own. Only, in this case, because in our practice, if you do right, there are also many questions, and if you if there is a chance that someone view or someone I should say personal, there is no, what should I say? If someone perceives that something is going to be decided against someone favor, then we, not only people, but in many cases, there are hue and cry that this has happened, such has happened. These are our tendencies developed nowadays. That's why it's not the matter of legal shortcomings. I think, though I have also written in chat box, it's the issue of professionalism. There are some of the issues in government public entities also, not in all, but there are cases. I don't negate those. There are issues of professionalism in public entity as well as in the private market. And the issue of ethics also. If we go with ethics, there will not be problem. We have already heard, and there are quite non-compliance, we should say, or the fair market. We don't have fair market and fair competition. That has also made us made our procurement in such a special circumstances more challenging. And regarding G2G process, just I want to highlight one issue, that G2G process in normal condition, it works quite well, but in such a pandemic situation, all the nations are in pandemic situation, and that has made also, though there are many steps in G2G, but this pandemic, global pandemic, has made G2G much more challenging in my view. Thank you, giving me opportunity to put my view. And just I would like to highlight that in such a, because we are talking about public procurement, if some of the government representative also would have participated in panelists, that would have been made such talk much more fruitful and much more because many in Nepali case, what we see that most of the people blame government, but government is the government, and it is the only institution that has the sole responsibility to put or to act for the welfare of the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kant. I think all those inputs that you provided, which has enriched the session that we're conducting right now. I think I understand from Nepal Economic Forum that they did try to invite, government agencies in this event, but I think there was a shortage of time that we couldn't really, include the way we wanted the persons from the government agencies. I think Kabita ji wants to interject and probably respond to some of the point that Mr. Kant has said. Kabita ji, please go ahead.
Oh, it was, I think, less interjecting than maybe supplementing, which is that I think, Mr. Kant, you made a series of interesting comments and then a question. One thing that and it would be interesting if someone had responded and joined the panel, to the point of bashing or critiquing the government or saying that there was a lack of a centralized response. I would be really curious to hear from you and others what has been the centralized response. Because, getting even, let's look at a very specific case of the supply of oxygen and the back and forth that has ensued between the CCMC and the Ministry of Health about who actually controls oxygen supply, that has had very immediate and devastating effects on people's ability to access oxygen and live, is really distressing. And so I think the government is tremendously powerful. And if anything, I wish, and I'm speaking as an individual, that the government would recognize the amount of power it has and wield that power. I think that's where people's frustration comes from.
Yeah, thank you, Kabita ji. I think now we are only left with 10 minutes, and I'll try to take up 1 or 2 questions, or 3 or 4 questions from the chat box that I've received, and then probably also ask you to the panelists to close your provide your closing remarks also on the way when you respond to those questions. So one question I think I want to take up, and it's a quite interesting question that has come from a professor from BPCAT. It is a medical health institution and in the eastern part of Nepal, where he talks about the government hospitals have to conduct procurement in a very short span of time, and the government, the people who are involved in the procurement in those entities are not totally capacitated to understand the procurement process and conduct the procurement in such a short time. So what can be done probably to ensure that they are equipped with the resources that is required, or what can be done to make sure that they get the enough resources to ensure that their lack of understanding of skills in the procurement process could be filled, that gap could be filled. Professor Trepte, if you want to respond to that.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think the problem of capacity is a general issue. I mean, I think that really is a big problem. In many legal systems, you not only have the law and regulations, you quite often have something called a handbook or a manual of procurement. And that's really where you would expect some, if you like, hands-on guidance on how to do procurement. Because the law is for lawyers. I mean, most procurement officers don't want to read the law, and I don't think they should, but they need guidance on how to use the law. preferably guidance that doesn't always refer back to the law. So it's very useful to have these manuals on how to do procurement. And of course, if you can follow that guidance, you would automatically comply with the law. Now, that happens in some systems. It doesn't happen everywhere. But one of the lessons that we can learn, and we should have learned this very quickly. I mean, we are 24 months into this pandemic, almost 24 months into it. One of the lessons we should learn is that when we find these problems of implementing the law, when we find problems of compliance with the law, if the manual doesn't exist, then we should write one. We should have compliance guides and manuals for procuring entities, so that if they don't have the capacity, we can't suddenly create sort of seminars and conferences and qualifications for them in the short time. But you can give them what is effectively a teaching manual, a teaching guide, and I think that's something that we could be doing. Lots of countries have started, have already prepared guidelines for these sorts of emergency procurement, and I think that's something that would be very useful to spread across all countries facing this capacity problem. Because we don't have the luxury of putting people in to teach. What we can do is provide written guidance to help everybody through it, and you can get inspiration from lots of guides that have already been drafted, I think. But it is a huge capacity problem, and Nepal is certainly not alone in that.
Thank you, Professor Trepte. I think there's a question probably to Dr. Adhikari from Mr. Abhishek Pasnet, where he says, how do you rate Nepal's public procurement practice if you see it from the perspective of 4 principles, transparency, accountability, value for money? He is suggesting you should just be at 4 out of 10. What is your take on that, Dr. Adhikari?
Thank you, Abhishek ji, that you make me speak again. That's good. I don't want to rate in this fiscal right now. No, this is not the right forum to give that type of answer right now. And the one thing that I would like to say, I have been writing on this issue also, if you have followed my writing, in the procurement as well as ethical decision-making part. So I've been continuously writing. I've just, what I would like to say is that there are 2 types of procurement. Most of the procurement are successful procurements, and many government officials, public entities are making successful and good procurements. So this is not that every procurements are failure and we are doing bad. No. The second thing, what we have to understand is that in terms of large and addressing to the emergency situations from the last year that we are saying, these are much in controversy. And these controversies are related with political leaders and indecision, what to say, the decision making in the bureaucratic sector. So these type of things are demonstrating by the activities that we are seeing from the outside now. So at this moment, what we are talking about is what is happening with response to the pandemic situation in emergency situations. So this is the thing that we have to understand. This is the limitation of, I think, today's talk. No, so this is how I am talking about the failure pandemic responses that are in controversy, and that is what we are talking about, and that has been affecting the people at large. So I think at this point, this is what I would like to wisely say. No?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Adhikari. I think I'll move to Kabita ji here. So Kabita ji, there are, I think, a couple of questions from in the chat box that I think will be more appropriate if you respond to them. One is, you're doing a volunteering work in terms of getting the supplies chain corrected in an effective manner. But what I think the question is, can this volunteering initiatives also make the government accountable for the failures, or what can you do to make the government accountable for all their follies and everything that has happened in the procurement process? Another thing, I think, associated question there too is what do you see your private sector response to that? We don't have anyone from the private sector today, but from your standpoint, how do you think the private sector should be responding to this procurement situation? That is a question probably from Sumana Shrestha, yeah, I think.
I'm curious as to whether Sumana was levying that question at me. That would be interesting.
No, that wasn't.
Yeah, I didn't think so, Sumana. So I will actually let others answer that question. Sumana and I are organizing very, very closely together. But I will answer the previous question. I will provide some of my thoughts on the previous question, and then others will supplement. I think something that is really important that I was mentioning earlier in terms of a civic response that is effective is exactly the same and true for any kind of government response that is effective. And that is seeing others who have expertise, knowledge, resources, connections as co-collaborators who are there to build with you and not as a threat and not as a challenge. And so I really think that that is a core principle that needs to be operated on. When that isn't happening, I think that there must be a way to hold actors responsible for what is effectively criminal negligence. And I'm not saying that as a lawyer, I'm saying that in lay people's terms, but there's probably like a pretty good legal case to be made for that too. So I think that for that, again, people like Semanta yourself would probably have more of the expertise around Nepali law. I'm still learning it. I still need to take the bar here. I'm barred elsewhere. But I think looking at what is available is one, and holding particular agencies liable under existing law, getting rid of people in those positions and sanctioning them, both sanctioning agencies and sanctioning individuals to the extent that you can. And then third, I think in a lot of places there's a conversation about don't vote in people who are going to make these decisions. That's true, but I think that actually requires working on a lot of public education. And so I hope that is what can happen, that there's a combination of like public education alongside with like using every legal avenue that exists to prosecute and hold culpable the individuals who have chosen to ignore the crises around us, even as others might be trying to address them. And I will say one thing about the private sector response. I would like others to address this again, but in terms of what is effective, again, I think one set of groups within even COVID Alliance have, as private sector entities, put in significant portions of their money to try and push work forward. So I think that has also been energizing for me and others.
Yeah. Thank you, Kabita ji. I think I'll respond probably to that private sector question from the knowledge I have. The usual government setup for procurement process does not apply to the private sector directly, but I understand, working with the private sector organizations, that they do have their own internal procurement system, which try to follow a competitive process. They don't just hire or they don't just award contracts without any competition these days. They try to make sure that all the contracts that are awarded are at arm's length principle and everything is done. But the entire robustness that is there, I won't say robustness, the entire labyrinth of procurement process that applies to the government process does not really apply to the private sector. So they can really cut short the process if that's required, and conduct the procurement very quickly. We're almost we've actually crossed 5:30, so I think I might have to end the discussion for today here itself. And probably I think as the next stage, I think we kind of discuss a lot of topics, including whether the laws of Nepal are perfectly enough or not to respond to the pandemic, what needs to be done as the next step, whether it's all about capacity or the integrity of the people involved in the procurement process, and also questions of how a civic society response can really be helpful in meeting some of the gaps that are created due to ineffective response from the government. As the chair of the Nepal Economic Forum, Sujit Sakya just wrote in the chat, I think this has allowed discourse to begin, and I think Nepal Economic Forum will continue the discussion to make sure that the next pandemic we face or next emergency we face, there are some clarities in the law, there are some clarities in the process that will try to address some of the shortcomings that we made or the government made during this pandemic. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, participants, first of all, for taking out time, being there with us, and actively participating in the discussion. I'm really, really grateful to the panel members, everyone, especially Professor Trepte from the UK. Rajendra, I know you also have, a lot of other assignments, and you're quite a busy person. And Kabita, I know, Kabita ji, you've been burning, time the entire 24 hours working on in this COVID response. So thank you, everyone, for taking out time and being there with us today. I would like to now close the panel, and probably we'll engage and continue this discussion ahead also. Thank you very much. Namaskar.